environment matters tremendously, even for the greats. Steph Curry is an example. I covered Steph's early career. Nobody thought this was going anywhere when the Warriors
Ooh.
had different ownership and they were run
Yeah.
incompetently, and Steph was injured all the time because they had people in charge of the medical that didn't know what they were doing. It's just amazing what gets unleashed
Are there any
talent-wise.
similarities? Early Steph
But
and early Purdy?
um, I do think in how they're discussed. People are going to blanch at that because Steph is an all-time great, and Brock is still fighting just for the reputation of good. But in how they're discussed and dismissed, there are similarities in that Steph Curry was not physically the profile that people expected. And even if he was respected as an outside shooter enough to where he was drafted in the lottery, there wasn't that expectation of a superstar impact. So once that impact started, then there was a lot of dismissiveness, or people just have to be rough with him and it'll all be different. There is this reality that the situation matters.
There's a big analytics NFL website for a long time called Football Outsiders. And the irony is they're not football outsiders. They're deep football insiders who are big into analytics. But you might be my favorite football outsider, someone who really loves football and talks about football. But
Oh yeah.
but as I read in your Brock Purdy extension take article, you consider yourself, and this is how you started, or at least how you became very famous and successful, and your NBA media. And now you just have a great Substack. But we were texting on Wednesday because we were the great Brock Purdy, Baker Mayfield, and the Trevor Lawrence debates have taken hold this week, as they often do. And you have takes on this subject, so this is the perfect discussion.
Well, we've got the two topics. The one is the discussion of Brock and his extension, and then the other is my opinion that a lot of NFL conversation about quarterbacks is downstream of the top line statistics. And whichever one you want to go with, we can go with that one. The second one is a little more niche, I think, but I deeply believe it. I deeply believe that a lot of how we talk about these quarterbacks, even in 2025, are these very basic stats reminiscent of RBI and batting average were for baseball. But hey, man, it's your show. You tell me, which one should we go with?
No, let's start with that, because that's what we were texting about today. Your general theory that, and I think it goes to Baker throwing 41 touchdowns and all of that,
Yeah.
because you're not your team Brock in the case of the Brock Baker comparison.
Yeah, I mean, I'm team Brock, but I don't feel any need to tear down Baker necessarily. I just was looking at that debate as an interesting one because everybody having it neglects to mention that Baker had 13 fumbles last season and I believe ended the season in the playoffs on a fumble. Now, Brock fumbles the ball too sometimes. I'm not getting into a whole Brock versus Baker debate. I just find it interesting that that very important aspect of Baker's season just barely mentioned, just not talked about. And I think that a lot of that has to do with the classic way, and I'll pull it up. I just have Lamar Jackson here randomly. When you go on Football Reference or ESPN, they give you the QB record, they give you the completion percentage, the yards per attempt, and of course, touchdowns and interceptions. That's what you see again and again and again and again. And I think it'd almost be a different conversation if they showed you fumbles or if they showed you sacks, which are really important. And sacks are pretty stable. We talk about different offensive lines, but as the Football Outsiders would tell you, quarterbacks are more in control of how they get sacked than we might think. And it's more stable year to year than what we might think. So maybe Caleb is going to be better with Ben Johnson, but that seems to be a feature of his game that he gets sacked a lot. That's part of it. And sacks are important. They're drive killers. You get sacked, you're probably not going to successfully end that drive. And with fumbles, it's similar. I mean, Baker had 13 last year. Trevor Lawrence, it's been a huge problem for him, although
He had 3
didn't
last
have
year.
he didn't have a lot, but he also didn't play a lot and he didn't produce a lot. But fumbles, that's an issue. If you fumble, you are probably not getting it back as a quarterback. It's not like a running back fumble because of where it happens. it is probably killing a drive if you do get it back for the reason the sack kills a drive. And if it's snatched, then that's all bad. That's just a really, really bad situation. And that's just not going to be in the top line of statistics. So we're not going to discuss that. So that's my theory. My theory is for all our smarty pants stuff, for all of our analytical conversations, for all of the PFF grades, if the top line stats, every time we look at a basic superficial view of the stats, is analogous to the stats we cared about in baseball before the Moneyball revolution, when we thought RBIs were a big deal and batting average, then that is going to confound and mess up the conversation about production. We're not going to be having the right conversation necessarily. That's
Yeah.
my thought.
And I agree with it. But as you know from baseball, there are ways to hack efficiency, right? I mean, I think
Yeah.
a lot of the times when you like, we can debate PFF, who are these graders? What are the guys looking at? But when you look at their grades for the best defensive ends, they generally line up with the guys that we think are the best defensive ends. In baseball, and the A's were a great example, and I covered them a lot. Like, you could hack efficiency. Like, oh, this guy, look at his average. Look at his on base. Yeah, but he only plays against right-handed pitchers. He never plays against left-handed pitchers. And they did a great job of that. And I do think part of when you get into the advanced metrics of quarterbacking, what throws people is you'll look at some of the efficiency stats and it'll be like Tua number 1, Brock number 2. And somebody goes, I'm taking Josh Allen out over both of those guys. I would say the other comparison would be like baseball defense, right? Because to your point, you used to look at a shortstop and go, the shortstop with more errors must be the worst shortstop. And then somebody came along, maybe it was Bill James or somebody else, and said, well, sometimes a shortstop with more errors is just the guy that is able to get to more balls and so has more chances and thus makes more mistakes because he tries to do stuff that the other guy can't do.
Yeah, and that was a revolution that happened in baseball where there were certain players in the outfield on the other end of it who made all these diving catches and then were reputed to be these great defensive players, but really they were just super slow.
Yeah, bad breaks.
Somebody else could just easily catch what was a lazy fly ball without tumbling and getting into top plays. And that stuff's hard. I mean, it's really hard to know when baseball has done a good job with it of trying to track all of that. Football is fun. Football is fun in part because we're a little bit caveman with it. I think basketball has gotten to more of a place where people in its media are just so consumed with efficiency and so into the numbers. There are those people in football, but the conversation is dominated by touchdown interceptions, which it's good to have more touchdowns. It's good to have fewer interceptions, but that's a little bit like RBI, where it's very situationally informed. If you pass the ball and a guy tumbles at the 1 yard line, you don't get a touchdown. And also the interesting thing too, and Neil Payne, he's got a Substack, he's a stats guy, has said is that interceptions are noisy. Like the quarterback really isn't in control of where the incomplete pass goes. He's trying to get the pass to a particular point. If it doesn't hit that point, a lot could happen. And maybe there's an aspect of certain throws are riskier than others, but interceptions year to year are a lot noisier than what you might think. So that perhaps shouldn't be the stat that we're really honing in on. And there are caveats. There are some people who are very interception averse, and that's fairly stable, like Aaron Rodgers was. But yeah, you see these wild swings. I'm trying to see what Baker's is because he had CJ Stroud was an example.
He had 16. Actually. Baker had 16 last year, which led the league.
Yeah. CJ Stroud, his rookie year, 5 interceptions. And there was a lot of compliments, but that's just sure to regress. That's not going to be something that is going to happen. And lo and behold, he had 12 the next season. Not terrible, but his interception percentage goes from 1 to 2.3. And it just seems like we know a lot more, but we don't necessarily prioritize the right things when having these conversations. And then the conversations aren't exactly right. And a lot of that is the top line frames it. The top line frames what we talk about and what we care about. And that's why even if QBR is this big soup that's hard to understand, I tend to trust QBR more because it's incorporating a lot
Well,
of that stuff.
there's a guy in Seattle named Hugh Millen who does radio and played for a long time. And somebody told me recently, I've never talked to him, but somebody told me that he did a 5-year analysis and he found that QBR is the most correlated to winning.
Yeah.
This came up because we were talking about specifically Baker and Brock, and you brought up fumbles. And, shouldn't that be a part of the conversation? So just not to do a deep dive here, but I did a quick little analysis of the last 2 years plus the last 5 years. Baker, 13 fumbles last year, same as Cousins. You're right. This is never really Brock had 7 on the percentage of handles. So I took pass attempts, sacks, rushing attempts, all that stuff. Brock was 1.3%. Baker was 2%. In 23, there's your guy, Trevor Lawrence, 1 behind Tua, by the way, who had 13.
Yeah.
Baker only had 8. So it was kind of, a little bit of a flip. By percentage, 2 years ago, he was just barely ahead of Brock. And the last 5 years, though, he is one of in terms of fumble percentage, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Baker Mayfield is 6th in the league, and Trevor Lawrence is 2nd in the league. And Justin Fields is a significant outlier. And if you take the last 2 years and project the next 3, this is Brock's 5-year full season projection of 1.27%, which, as we see, would be near the bottom of the list of the guys who fumble. They don't, maybe he doesn't handle the ball as much in the way that we're talking about here. Well, but anyway.
What's kind of interesting is that, well, it's not kind of interesting. We got to sell it. It's very interesting.
Super interesting.
Is that I believe this was Trevor Lawrence's career high in QBR, despite being viewed as his statistically worst season. And I think that's just him fumbling less, because the fumbles are so devastating to your actual offensive output that simply doing that less made it more productive than seasons in which Trevor Lawrence was more praised. So I'm trying to look that up. 59.5 that he had in his 10 games by QBR. This was the best Trevor Lawrence season. And yes, I think that's just related to him not fumbling all the time. It's just devastating when that's happening.
So do you, let's talk about like real people. If you think the stats for football are in the Stone Age, are you connecting that to the discussion about Brock Purdy? Like, do you think it's part of Purdy? Because Purdy's great at these efficiency stats. When you look at them, the most efficient quarterback? I don't know. That seems right. Like, I think that's part of it, is some of the efficiency numbers.
Yeah, I think to a degree. I mean, Purdy's his own thing. It's been highly generative for you and highly generative for the football pundit community, because so many people bring their baggage to the table with Brock. And I don't know if the issue with him is that people don't trust QBR, or that it's people don't trust it because of the draft pick, or they think Shanahan would make him the thing, or I don't know, whatever it is with Brock. I just know that he's got to do it at a high level for a while until people buy in. And so I'm very zen about Brock Purdy in that way. I just go, well, if he's that guy and he does it enough, eventually people will come over to his side. And if it doesn't happen, then it doesn't happen. But for now, a lot of people are just they're not going to be convinced by an argument about it. But I do think if there was more respect for those statistics or that view of it, and his propensity to have these 20-yard completions over the middle of the field, then his stature might be elevated. But that's just not how the regular fan connects to football. I think they connect to it through touchdown to interceptions, total yards, which he does pretty good job at. And those stats, he's just not statistically, it's not eye-popping. It's not eye-popping like Baker Mayfield's last season is outwardly eye-popping.
Every successful quarterback is an outlier, right? Kyle Shanahan said before the Trey Lance draft, that great press conference he had, he said there aren't 32 people on the face of the earth capable of playing quarterback at an acceptable level. Not a great level, an acceptable level.
Yes.
And so just to be a top 15 quarterback, like Jared Goff is an extreme outlier. We already know that Josh Allen and Lamar Jackson are outliers. Yeah. And then to do it when you look like Brock, or your arm is like Brock's, or like, that's a double outlier, right? Drew Brees is an outlier. Tom Brady is an outlier. Dan Marino's an outlier, but Drew Brees is like the outlier of outliers.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So I just, even though it's funny as you look at like the top 10 quarterbacks, and it's like Montana, Breeze,
Well,
Brady.
It's funny.
They're not the biggest, strongest all the time.
It's funny that you bring up Breeze, because I think there are some people who compared Brock to Breeze, and because Breeze had accomplished so much, I saw this pushback of like, oh my God, hold on there. Hold the phone there. And yeah, that's a steep mountain to climb for Purdy in terms of career accomplishment. But I grew up in San Diego, and I remember when Drew Brees came on the scene, and there was no, oh my God, Drew Brees is here. He's got this. The Chargers are saved. There was no sense of that. The way he was regarded was worse early on in his career than what Brock Purdy was regarded on early in his career. So it's funny to bring up Breeze in that context. The statement you had though about there aren't 32 people who can do it, I think that's really important to understand for the contract conversation, because I was tearing my hair out as a football outsider watching how the Purdy contract was being debated and deliberated over. It just wasn't rational to me. And I think in many ways NFL media is better than NBA media. I think NBA media can be indulgent, can be too player friendly, can be too into player empowerment, afraid to criticize. And I like that NFL media can be more critical because fans feel critical and it can mirror that. But I do think, as I wrote, that NBA media, because of that tendency of being very player focused, is in a way more logical on contracts, and we're used to it and we've internalized it. And when an all-star gets a max contract, we don't get into this angry high dudgeon about it like Chris Sims. We're not livid over it because we understand something. We understand that there's no way to replace that guy, that the way the structure is set up, you might not feel like he should be making as much as LeBron James, but there's no way to get somebody else as good as him. So that's the contract. That's just how it's going to be. NFL doesn't have a max contract in that way, but it's a very similar situation where I love Colin Cowherd, but I saw he seemed offended that Brock was making roughly the same as Josh Allen. And I get that, but you don't get to then auction on Josh Allen and take the money you would have spent on Brock and get Josh Allen. The way the NFL is set up is similar to the NBA. You get to keep your very best. You get to keep your stars. They don't ever hit the market. We have this idea of like it's a free market and free agency, go get somebody. The good stuff, by and large, doesn't come out in that market. And that's true of quarterbacks. And I feel like it's increasingly true of edge rushers where, I want to bid on a Myles Garrett. Ooh, that's going to be, turns out I can't.
Yeah.
It's just
and left tackles veterans. And tackles, offensive tackles.
Yeah. It's like on that market, it's aging veterans, guys with injuries. And so people have these conversations, these debates of, I wouldn't pay this guy 50 million. I would pay him 30 million. And that's just, you don't get to. It's not an option. It's not available to, because that's the market. And that the reason it's the market is because you've got no other real plausible option. And forgive me for monologuing on it, but right there, that section of the
this is what you wrote. The choice is between quarterback who understands the system and has performed well, or the great unknown, which usually fails.
Yeah, that's the choice. Most draft picks fail. And so I saw Grant Cohn. I like Grant, but I saw him debating with Larry Krueger on this issue. And he said, here's what I would do. What would I do when put to that decision? And he said that he would go with Mac Jones and draft Shedeur Sanders. Now, look, there's a world where maybe that's the right choice. Maybe. I don't know. Mac Jones had one good season. I don't know. Shedeur Sanders, maybe the league was wrong about him, like they were wrong about Purdy. But the point I'm making is Grant could disagree. I don't think that's a decision Grant makes if it's his job on the line. That's the point I would make. That's not a decision you would make if your job is on the line. You don't go with that decision. It's plausible that that's the best decision, but you don't go with it. And these teams don't go with it. They pay Tua. They get, lambasted for paying Tua out in Miami, but I get why they pay Tua. I've seen the Dolphins when Tua doesn't play. They're horrible. They look terrible. And so it's very convenient to say that this guy isn't worth that or this quarterback's not worth that. But in the NFL, there aren't 32 guys who can do this job. And the gap between the guy who does a good job and understands your system and whoever is stepping in to replace him who doesn't get those reps is huge. And so that's why this happens. That's why these guys get paid. And then the other point to make on top of that is that I also think the gap in pay doesn't actually get you much. Like if you
Right.
negotiated Brock down another 10, what was Chris Sims saying he should make 25, 35 million? I was trying to remember what it was when he was
I don't
like, I
remember
wouldn't
what he
pay him.
said, but basically it's 20 million less for Baker or Sam Darnold, for example,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
You could
yeah, yeah.
save 20 and do what? Sign a second linebacker?
Well, that's the thing. I mean, that relates to the first point where it's this illusion of this free market where if you don't spend on one thing, you can spend on this other better thing. The better
Keep
stuff
Debo.
isn't there. Yeah, keep Debo. That's what you get to do. You get to keep an injury-riddled veteran. And my other point is if you want a quarterback for 35 million, you're going to want him for 55 million. The quarterback that you would want for 35 that you wouldn't want for 55, that doesn't exist
Right.
because yes,
Well,
it's not a thing.
here would be an example. If you're Seattle and Sam Darnold has a Pro Bowl year, you don't then cut Sam Darnold and go, great, we'll go get another $35 million guy again. Because like
No,
Sam Darnold and Baker, those are not most of the guys you get in free agency, right?
no.
Like Sam was Sam was only because the Niners found Brock was Sam not a Niner last year. And then only because
Yeah,
the Vikings had JJ McCarthy is he not a Viking again. So you don't get to do that cycle. If you're Seattle, it'd be dumb if he has a great year to not pay him 55 because the alternative is we let him go and now we'll find another guy for 35 and you
yeah.
probably won't. Maybe there's Derek Carr,
No,
but probably there isn't. Right.
no. It's the NBA terminology is open for a reason. You're able to get
Right.
that
Right.
deal below the top rate for a reason. There's a checkered past, there's an injury history. And let's go with the Grant Cohn idea of the Mac Jones thing. Let's say that Mac Jones really pops and has just an incredible season. And oh my God, it turns out Kyle can just do this with multiple guys. But you don't have Mac Jones signed long term, and so you're just going to have to do the same thing over again. This is why these teams do it. These teams lock in a quarterback at in that rate in the 50s range, and you try to build around it because most of the sport isn't penny pinching on the guys that you have. Most of the sport is nailing your draft picks because they're cost controlled, and it's a violent sport and a lot of the other skill positions wear out very quickly. And the reason these teams lock in the quarterback guy, I think one of the reasons is that quarterback performance is more stable than these other positions and more predictable. Cornerbacks, it's volatile. Quarterbacks, not so much, more dependable. So you've got that stability, you lock it in. And that's why for all the media warnings about how you don't pay your quarterback, don't pay an elite quarterback, don't pay a like mid quarterback or a good quarterback, elite quarterback money. I just think it's wrongheaded because the teams that keep going to the playoffs are the teams that do that. They either
Yeah.
have the quarterback in the rookie deal or they do that. Teams that are trying to do some other, I don't even know, whatever the Steelers do, it's just that doesn't work. You don't want that.
Yeah, I mean, they're right. The one thing we never talk about in quarterback value, especially when you have a situation like a consistent coach, GM, owner, all that, is like, guys, I'm not saying it's worth 15 or 20 extra million to not have to do this every year, but it's worth something to not have
Yes.
to do this every year. And isn't there a cap on how good your guy can get if he's not your guy, if it's a different
Mhm.
guy every
Yeah.
year? I also have come to believe in this theory or my theory, that way more that all of us, anybody who's successful, is more of a system quarterback than anyone wants to admit. And I think
Mhm.
part of the reason is that when you say that, it sounds like you're saying this person only succeeded because of help. Instead of what I think the reality, which is this person reached their full potential because they were allowed to.
I think you're making a great point. There's a term for this that the San Antonio Spurs used, corporate knowledge. Their advantage was having a bunch of guys who understood how to play within the San Antonio Spurs system. I think we've seen something similar with the Warriors. There's a real value to that. And so we're having this conversation sometimes, and system quarterback is used to dismiss Purdy. But we forget there's this other reality, that there's a true value to understanding everything you have to do within the Shanahan system and how to drive that particular car. And if you just swap this guy out and swap somebody in who doesn't necessarily know how to operate the system, they're not going to do as well. And this relates to what you were saying about how there's a real value to not doing this over and over again. I think that that's true. So yeah, system matters. It matters a lot. And that's actually an argument for maybe keeping a guy who understands the system and has been in it for years.
And you can also make mistakes that way, right? It's hard to know exactly. Like a guy can almost look like another guy, and then maybe Brock just understands exactly when to push what Shanahan wants in a way that maybe Mac Jones wouldn't. I don't know. Like we'll find out with the Spurs. They're replacing Popovich. Is it what you call it, institutional knowledge? No.
Corporate knowledge.
Is the corporate knowledge enough, or is there
well, they don't have the guys who know the knowledge anymore. But back in the day, like Tony Parker, Tim Duncan.
Oh, right. Understood. Yeah. Like I would say Greg Popovich reached his full potential because he had great players and he had a consistent front office, and just plugging somebody else in doesn't automatically mean, the movie Trading Places, right? Where Dan Aykroyd is successful and Eddie Murphy is homeless, and they swap them on a $1 bet, right? What are they? The Mortimer and whatever.
Yeah. Sell Mortimer, buy Mortimer, buy.
And the reality and it's nature versus nurture is really what we're talking about here. And the reality is that it's both. Like, oh, well, Eddie Murphy's character, it worked. It's like, yeah, Eddie was incredibly charismatic and smart, and like it wouldn't have just worked with anybody. It worked in this, So yeah, I don't know. I've forgotten where we started with this, but here's the other thing. Here's the other thing, Ethan. It doesn't matter to Kyle Shanahan that if Brock played for somebody else.
Yeah.
Just like if Steph Curry played for somebody,
that he would suck on the Jets.
Right.
Yeah. Well, Steph Curry is also an example. Again, like environment matters tremendously, even for the greats. Steph Curry is an example. I covered Steph's early career. Nobody thought this was going anywhere when the Warriors had different ownership and they were run incompetently, and Steph was injured all the time because they had people in charge of the medical that didn't know what they were doing. It's just amazing what gets unleashed.
Are there any similarities? Early Steph and early Purdy?
I do think in how they're discussed. People are going to blanch at that because Steph is an all-time great, and Brock is still fighting just for the reputation of good. But in how they're discussed and dismissed, there are similarities in that Steph Curry was not physically the profile that people expected. And even if he was respected as an outside shooter enough to where he was drafted in the lottery, there wasn't that expectation of a superstar impact. So once that impact started, then there was a lot of dismissiveness, or, people just have to be rough with him and it'll all be different. But there is this reality that the situation matters. Clay was not going to be any kind of all-star before Steve Kerr took over. And when Flip Saunders and the Timberwolves wanted to trade for Clay, a lot of people were going, really? Like, what, him?
What were they offering?
Kevin Love. It was rumored that they were offering Kevin Love, which made it all the more mystifying. There was a lot of pressure on the Warriors to do that deal. A lot of people, if you asked me, I would have said do that deal at that time. And what was happening behind the scenes at that time was Jerry West was losing his mind because he thought Clay was so much better than what the system was showing. And he was tearing his hair out. He was going crazy over it about Mark Jackson's coaching and saying this team doesn't pass. This team doesn't pass the ball. They don't move the ball. They've got to pass. We're the last in per possession passes. Jerry West was an analytics guy back then, even as an old man. and they make the switch. They get a different coach. The coach is into moving the ball all over the place, and boom, Klay Thompson flourishes, and he goes from being a player who's regarded as a bit of a specialist to an all-star and now a Hall of Famer. And I don't know if that happens if they just continue with Mark Jackson's coaching style, which was all just Steph, dribble, 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 pick and roll, top of the key. I don't know if that happens. So there's just this reality, we use it to denigrate people who flourish, but it is a team game and there is a bigger structure. And you're going to squander talent with incompetent people involved, and you're going to elevate talent with competent people involved and show what they can do. I don't know where we're at with the 49ers in this whole conversation, but I like telling that story. I also
That's a
like
great
telling,
story.
I also like Andrew Bogut saying in one of the meetings that I wasn't present for, but was relayed to me, we could have won 50 games with a dog coaching the team.
Yeah, which is great. But, like, there's the moment in the championship game or the moment when you have to go, you know what, let's put Andre Iguodala in the starting lineup. And that's where I like to bring it back to quarterbacking. I do think you could probably get Sam Darnold or Mac Jones to get similar numbers to Brock Purdy in a given season.
Yeah,
but I also
sure.
think there's probably a hard to measure. What you're paying for is the small difference. And the small difference costs $25 million. And the same would be said for Josh Allen, or Mahomes. Like, look at Mahomes. Last year he went 15-1. But what would we have said the year before? These 10-6, 27 touchdowns, 14 interceptions. And let's say he was being paid appropriately, where he was making $25 million more than the next guy. And we'd go, why?
Mahomes is in a very narratively interesting space right now. I didn't know we were going to talk about this.
Yeah,
because we don't have this. We don't have this in the NBA. We don't have the top statistical performer suddenly having average looking stats, but still continuing to win big. And then that might be ripped out from under him this season because the schedule is difficult. All the gambling gurus say they were 10-0 in these one-score games, and that should regress. What is the conversation going to be about Mahomes potentially? Just a few months ago, we were talking about how he was going to overtake Tom Brady. That Super Bowl goes the way it goes. And I think if the production doesn't elevate to what we were used to, and if they fall on some hard times, I'm really curious about the Chiefs season. I know a lot of people are watching with Niners curiosity, but that's one where I don't know how we're going to process that, because we currently are still at, this is the best quarterback.
Yeah.
We're still there until somebody takes that mantle, until somebody seizes it, but he hasn't been producing as such regular season. And so I don't know. That's one that I'm very curious about.
You're right. We can finish with this because it's hard to, I came into this with the intent to do one topic with Ethan and do it in 15 minutes. And neither one of those things has happened. It's not possible, but I do think the Mahomes thing is interesting to your original point. Because his top line, he hasn't thrown 50 touchdowns in several years or even gotten close. But I would say this is where championships factor in.
Yeah.
I think until you really, really prove it, you just don't get the benefit of the doubt until you do. And then you always, if Josh Allen had a championship, if Lamar Jackson had a championship, I think we would talk about them as complimentary as we are about them in a very different way. And the analogy that I thought of is a musical one. Like, nobody ever says about Paul McCartney, well, I mean, he's written like 2 good songs since 1969. Right? Like, he was on the Beatles, maybe arguably the greatest band of all time. They were prolific for like a 7-year stretch, an 8-year stretch. And then it broke up and he was 28 and he's had a whole other career since then. But he won at such a high level that's who he is. And we don't go, well, did Wings ever put out? I mean, he had that one song with the piano that was really loud, but what else did he? And the one about the wife, but I mean, and that's fine. Fraud. That's fraud. You know what I mean? Like, and part of it is a musician. You got 60 years. Like Jimmy Page once said, like, we don't tour because I can't compete with the version of myself that did that music originally. Yeah. How could I, but
yeah, I mean, that's a great point. The top line point is one that I should have made that you made, that maybe Mahomes' production is better than it seems. If you go by QBR, Well, it's interesting. Both guys, both Purdy and Mahomes, basically had the same QBR. Mahomes was 67.6. Brock was 67.9. I don't know how we regard those seasons, but yeah, even though the top line wasn't impressive, there's good stuff going on. I will say there's good stuff happening. It just wasn't the crazy output that Mahomes had before. I don't know. It's intriguing. It's intriguing. The Chiefs are intriguing because we thought they had the magical winning juice that even if they were just winning by a little bit, they always knew how to win. And if that goes away, then it becomes well, what is this?
Yeah,
What happened?
but here's what I would say is like they've won 17, I think it's 17 straight one-score games and 12-0 last year in one-score games, something like that.
Wow. Yeah.
And people are like, well, we're already doing the thing. You did it. Joe Fortenbaugh did it to me the other day. You did it earlier. Like, well, that's going to change this year. And then what's going to happen?
Yeah, that's where I got
But like,
brainwashed. Was your YouTube channel? That's where that
but
happened.
like, what if it doesn't change? What if they go 8-4 in one-score games this year, which is still well above average? And
maybe they do know how to win. I mean, it's a good question. I think there's an aspect of it, right? There's an aspect of that being so. But I think where it gets complicated is what if the wheels fall off Kelsey? Like, how much of that sort of thing is based on personnel and the corporate knowledge certain guys might have?
for sure.
I think that these things do tend to regress, and that's such a statistical outlier that there has to be regression. But football's crazy like that, man. This is another difference between NBA and NFL is that NBA, you get to kind of play it enough times to know that it's true that James Harden's a playoff choker. But in the NFL, it's just, look, if Lamar Jackson suffers a devastating injury and never gets back to the postseason, we'll just never really know if that was randomness and variance or if he's just really that bad in the big moments for whatever reason. And that's just how it is.
Well, we have to wrap this up, but this will be, you know this, but I heard this stat the other day. This will be the 7th straight year with a different NBA champion, right?
Yeah.
And I remember several years ago when the Bucks won, I remember feeling, I'm not saying this is the correct opinion, but I just remember feeling like they were an illegitimate champion. And I didn't know, I was very curious about why, like, why do I feel that way? I don't watch every game. I'm not the guy that knows. And of course, the reason is because my entire life, legitimate champions won 4 in a decade, not just one. Like, right? The Celtics and Lakers ruled the 80s. The Bulls and Rockets ruled the 90s. The Spurs ruled the early 2000s with the Heat and the Mavs each got, like, you never won one. You either won none or you won 2 for the most part.
Yeah.
The 70s were that way. And it's a very
Dynasties.
it's a very different NBA now. I think less than half of the up until probably a decade ago, I think all the championships had been won by a handful of teams in the NBA.
I mean, this is a conversation right now that because they changed the CBA, it's made it so teams can't retain their guys and they can't continue those dynastic runs. But that whole conversation about the new NBA might be fouled up, to use a word, by the Oklahoma City Thunder, because they've prepared for this era. They've drafted all this talent. They traded their stars and have an insane amount of picks. And they have a model that just seems really hard to disrupt because they are young and inexperienced. And against the Thunder in that game 7, I saw them start missing a bunch of shots. It looked like they were choking, but they are so vicious defensively that they're almost choke proof in that way, where they might miss a bunch of shots, but if you can't score for a while, they're going to get their bearings back. They're becoming a little bit hated. I don't think people like how on one end of the floor, Shea Gilgeous-Alexander flops considerably and tumbles to the ground and then gets whistled. And then the other side of the floor, Lou Dort and Alex Caruso look to be dry humping the ball handler of the other team. It's an interesting sequence of phrases I just used. But, you know,
you're a professional.
Apparently. There's been some criticism of our new Thunder overlords and how they almost adopt, we're going to foul all the time and they're not going to call all of it. but they're also just really good at defense. Their defense is ridiculous, even without that advantage. And so there's a chance that even with all this new NBA, new champion every 7 years, if the Thunder win this one, it'd be hard to pick against them in the next one.
Yeah.
And they just have enough assets, cost controlled, that they might be able to be the team that breaks the system and keeps it going. I think that's a possibility. But if it's not them, I don't think it's going to be anybody. It's just going to go like this, one after the other. Like in Game of Thrones, it's a wheel that spins and there's always somebody on top.
So we're never going back in the NBA.
Until they change the structure, they change the structure in such a way to prevent continuity. And I think the team that really was undermined by it was the Nuggets. I think the Nuggets, if they could have kept everybody who mattered, would have kept it going. If they could have kept Bruce Brown, they could have kept it going. But I think they were the first victims of the new CBA. With the Bucks, that was more Chris Middleton getting injured. With the Nuggets, I think they were, the NFLification of the NBA struck the Nuggets first and prevented them from having a run.
By the way, Friday, May 23rd, the debut of Random Offense, which I also like interpreting it as random offense.
But Random Offense, either way.
Two-way. Random Offense is just this YouTube channel you created for this live show from two, and people can I guess there's probably a producer backstage filtering out bad questions, but people can ask questions.
But you're also allowed to ask bad questions. I'm open to anything. I'm very open to it. Yeah, I like Random Offense as a phrase because that's something that Andre Iguodala used to tell me all the time, that the hardest offense to guard was random offense.
Yeah, that's good.
He had a lot of good ones. He said a lot of trenchant things, a lot of wild things back in the day.
The one I remember from your book was no, not Draymond. Bruce Frazier.
The Grays.
Yeah, playing out like he coached basketball somewhere internationally, and he said they struggle to play in the gray area.
Yeah. I think he was in Japan. And he said, man, they'll run a play exactly the way that they're supposed to run the play, but when it gets chaotic, that's when the gray area happens, and they don't know how to operate in the grays. Yeah, that was.
And I think your point was Draymond plays well in the gray. I think that was part
of it. Oh, yeah. Draymond understands the grays. I'm fascinated by the grays. There was something that Aaron Rodgers said that was really interesting to me a couple of years ago, where he was frustrated with I know Aaron Rodgers frustrated. It's hard to believe, but he was frustrated with some of his younger receivers and offensive players. And he was saying, we're at the point where they understand running the play and where you're supposed to go, but they don't know why we're running the play. And that actually matters quite a bit. And I think that connects to the grays, because there's this thing of you need to know why you're doing what you're doing in order to operate in that zone where something happens or there's a breakdown, and maybe you don't run to that spot for that reason because we're trying to do something. So anyway, yes, promoting myself, two-way, May 23rd, 1 p.m. Pacific, since you have mostly Pacific time viewers, 4 p.m. Eastern, and we talk about sports and culture. And I think it's a great way to get some interactivity going, Guy, get some people involved, get some listeners. So please sign up for that. That would be great to all of you out there.
What do I have to sign up? I subscribe to the YouTube channel. Is that signing up, or?
Apparently there's a Zoom. I just got an email from the producer. I got to get people signed up to the Zoom. I'll put it in my Substack. I'll put something out. I'll try to make it easy for everybody. But yes, it's the inaugural, so I'm still getting the feel of it, but I think it'll be good. We'll talk about some of these cultural issues. I think we're going to be talking about Stephen A. Smith's bid to become president and how plausible that is. We might talk a little bit about this. Caitlin Clark insanity. I don't know, this insane situation with Ryan Clark versus Robert Griffin III. We're going to try to be reasonable about topics people are often unreasonable on. That's what we're going for.
Perfect.